Listen, when they told me the Keepers needed a human consultant for an emergency at the Vault Archive, I assumed it was a joke. A really elaborate one, the kind that takes 3 weeks to set up just to see you walk into a cargo bay full of exotic vacuum. But nope. There I was, Marcus Webb, barely qualified archivist and professional disaster magnate, being escorted through corridors of impossible architecture by a being made entirely of crystallized mathematics. The Vault Archive is what happens when a civilization spends 10 million years collecting everything and storing it in one place. We're talking about a repository the size of Jupiter, orbiting a dead star system maintained by the Keepers. The Keepers are this ancient collective of beings who basically invented preservation as a religion. They've got backup copies of backup copies, stored in dimensions I can't even pronounce without coughing up blood. They're the definition of careful, which is exactly why it's terrifying when something goes wrong. And something had definitely gone wrong. I arrived to find the main chamber in absolute chaos. Species I'd only seen in classified databases were crowded around a massive holographic display, all arguing in languages that made my translator implant weep. There were beings of pure energy, crystalline structures, liquid intelligences in containment fields, and at least 3 types of silicon-based life forms that I'm pretty sure violated several laws of physics just by existing. They were all staring at the same thing, a perfect black cube floating in the center of the chamber, completely inert, completely impenetrable, completely unwilling to cooperate. Layer 0. The hidden layer. And it was giving absolutely nobody any answers. Sentinel-7, the Keeper representative, finally noticed me standing there like an idiot with my mouth open. Sentinel-7 looks like someone decided to arrange bureaucratic forms into a vaguely humanoid shape and then animated it through sheer spite. All angles and edges, constantly shifting, speaking in riddles even when asking for coffee. "The human has arrived," Sentinel-7 announced, as if I wasn't already painfully aware of that fact. "This is Marcus Webb, species Homo sapiens, cataloger of lower-dimensional archives. We have summoned you because all other attempts have failed." The chamber went quiet. Even the energy beings dimmed a little. "Failed how?" I asked, already knowing the answer was going to make me regret asking. 43 species have attempted access," Sentinel-7 continued. 43 have been unsuccessful. The Keepers are prepared to destroy Layer 0 and the archive completely if it cannot be accessed within 48 hours. The contamination risk is unacceptable. I stood there processing that. 48 hours. Destroy one of the most important repositories in the galaxy. And they were looking at me, a human who still occasionally got lost in databases, like I was the solution. The universe has a sense of humor, and it hates me personally. "What's in it?" I asked. "Unknown," Sentinel-7 said. "The archive was sealed by a previous civilization, species designation RKE-7. They encoded it with a lock that responds to none of our standard access protocols. The lock is not technological. It is not mathematical. It is not psychic or dimensional. It is something we do not understand." I looked at that black cube, floating there with its absolute refusal to cooperate. Something in my brain went click, like a puzzle piece falling into place. These beings around me were the smartest in the galaxy. They could do things with physics that would make Einstein weep. But they were looking at this problem the same way you look at a locked door, find the right key, open it, move on. What if the RKE-7 didn't think like that at all? What if they locked it with something nobody else would ever think to try? I looked around the chamber and grinned. This was either the best or worst idea I'd ever have. Probably both. "All right," I said. "I'm going to need 48 hours, a lot of coffee, and permission to do something that's going to sound completely insane to all of you." Sentinel-7's form shimmered, which I'd learned meant confusion. "Define insane," it said. "You'll know it when you see it," I answered. That should have been my first hint that I was about to change the galaxy forever. But at that moment, I was just thinking about how nice it would be to not get the archive destroyed on my watch. The next 20 hours were the weirdest audition I'd ever witnessed. The Galactic Council had decided that since I was here trying something weird, we might as well let the other species make their final attempts while I worked. It was like watching people try to solve a Rubik's Cube using increasingly creative and ultimately pointless methods. First up was Vextor, a being constructed from crystalline lattices that somehow achieved consciousness through pure mathematical harmony. Vextor approached Layer 0 with the kind of certainty that only comes from being right approximately 99% of the time. Vextor didn't walk. It flowed like frozen lightning, and when it reached the black cube, it began emitting pure mathematics. Equations so complex and beautiful that my translator implant just gave up and displayed error codes. The cube didn't even flicker. Impossible, Vextor's voice sounded like ice singing in a vacuum. The lock must have a logical component. Everything has a logical component. Logic is fundamental to all existence. I wanted to point out that love wasn't particularly logical, but Vextor looked like it was about 2 seconds away from quantum tunneling through someone's face, so I kept my mouth shut. Next came Plinth, an aquatic intelligence who communicated through bioluminescent pulses that translated into incredibly pretentious observations about the nature of existence. Plinth flowed through its containment field with the grace of a creature that had spent millions of years perfecting the art of being disappointed by everyone around it. Perhaps, Plinth's pulses translated, a being of sufficient cerebral capacity might perceive the lock through means your primitive species cannot comprehend. I raised my hand. I'm going to stop you right there. Your primitive species invented pizza. You're welcome. Plinth's lights flickered in a way that my translator rendered as extremely rude. It then proceeded to attempt access by somehow projecting pure consciousness at the cube. For about 3 seconds, something actually happened. The cube's surface rippled like water. Everyone leaned forward, then it stopped, and the cube was back to being an impenetrable void of nope. Fascinating, Plinth pulsed, which definitely meant frustrated. The lock appears to be filtering out attempts based on some variable I cannot quantify. 20 more attempts happened. Beings tried radiation, dimensional folding, psychic attacks, what appeared to be aggressive friendship. And at one point, something that involved singing in 17 harmonic frequencies simultaneously. The 17-frequency singing actually got further than most. The cube brightened for a full 10 seconds before retreating back into its void. Sentinel-7 glided past me, its bureaucratic form practically vibrating with anxiety. Your strategy remains undisclosed, it observed. The Council is beginning to doubt your efficacy. The Council can doubt my efficacy all it wants, I said. I'm working on something. Which was technically true. I was working on something. That something was thinking about what the Archie-7 might have been trying to protect, and why they would seal it in a way that no amount of scientific brilliance could crack. The archive was built by creatures, I kept thinking. Not machines, not algorithms. Creatures with thoughts and feelings and reasons to hide something precious. I watched the attempts continue, watched species that had conquered star systems and bent reality itself get systematically shut down by a black cube. And somewhere around attempt 37, while a being made of pure gravity was trying to crush the cube through sheer existential weight, I had a moment where my confidence cracked. What if I was wrong? What if I was about to embarrass myself in front of the most advanced beings in the galaxy? What if they destroyed the archive, anyway, and it turned out I was a complete moron? Then I remembered something my grandmother used to say. She said that the human advantage wasn't that we were smarter or stronger. It was that we understood that not everything that mattered could be measured. That sometimes the most important things were the ones that didn't make logical sense. I stood up. Everyone stopped what they were doing. Even the being made of gravity paused mid-crush. I'm ready, I announced. I need everyone to step back from Layer 0, and I need permission to try something you're all going to think is absolutely ridiculous. Vextor's crystalline structure flickered with what might have been annoyance. Plinth's lights dimmed in what definitely was. But Sentinel-7, that beautiful bureaucratic nightmare, processed my request through what sounded like 17 different approval committees, and then, amazingly, authorized it. You have one attempt, Sentinel-7 said. The cube will not respond to multiple applications of the same methodology. I walked toward the black cube, and the entire chamber fell silent. The archive around us seemed to hold its breath. 43 species had failed. The most advanced minds in the galaxy had been shut out, and now a human archivist was about to try something that would either save the archive or accelerate its destruction by 48 hours. I stood in front of that black cube and took a deep breath. This was it, either the dumbest thing I'd ever done, or the beginning of something none of us could predict. I opened my mouth and started to sing. The reaction was instantaneous and absolutely hilarious. Vextor's crystalline structure went rigid. Plinth's lights flashed in what I could only describe as panic. The being made of gravity actually gasped, which is impressive when you're an entity that shouldn't have lungs. Even Sentinel-7 stopped moving entirely, its form locked in a state that probably meant maximum confusion. But I kept singing. The song wasn't anything fancy. It wasn't some complex composition or a technically impressive piece of music. It was something I hadn't sung in years, something my grandmother taught me when I was 5 years old. It was about home, about the smell of rain on earth soil, about the feeling of sitting on a porch with someone you loved and not needing to say anything because the silence understood you. My voice cracked on the third verse. I'm not a great singer. I'm barely a decent one. But I kept going anyway because somewhere in my training, I'd learned that sometimes the point of something isn't to do it perfectly. It's to do it honestly. The black cube began to shimmer, just a little at first, like heat haze rising off pavement. But then more. The shimmer turned into light, pale and ethereal, like listening to music in the dark. The entire chamber lit up with that gentle glow, and I just kept singing, pouring everything into those words. The good parts of being human, the messy parts, the stupid parts, the beautiful parts that didn't make any sense, but felt true anyway. Illogical, I heard Vextor say, but its voice was different, quieter, almost wondering. The song contains no mathematical structure, yet the lock responds. Remarkable, Plinth pulsed, and for once it sounded genuinely impressed rather than condescending. The lock is not responding to data, it is responding to emotion. How is that possible? I hit the final note of the song, and the black cube simply came apart. Not exploded, not shattered. It just unstacked itself, like it was made of layers that had been holding their breath and finally got permission to breathe. The cube became light, and then the light became data, streams and streams of it, flowing into the archive like water finally finding its level. For a moment, nothing else happened. Then Layer 0 began to open. The council erupted. Species started communicating in languages I didn't even have translators for. Sentinel-7's form collapsed and reformed at least 7 times in rapid succession, which I assumed meant maximum bureaucratic shock. The chamber filled with sound and light, and the kind of chaos that happens when something everyone thought was impossible just became impossible to deny. I stood there breathing hard, my throat sore, still shocked that it had actually worked. Explain, Sentinel-7 demanded. The lock was designed to respond to mathematical and logical sequences. There is no mechanism by which a primitive acoustic pattern would trigger access. Yeah, about that, I said, finally catching my breath. I don't think the Archie-7 designed a lock at all. I think they designed a question. And the question was basically, will someone someday understand that not everything important can be proven? That there are some things that only make sense when you feel them? Layer 0 was fully open now, and data was pouring out. But it wasn't the kind of data the archive usually contained. This was different. This was music. Actual music, thousands of years old, preserved in perfect clarity. Alongside it came images, poetry, stories in languages I didn't know but somehow understood anyway. What is this? Vextor asked, and for the first time in our entire conversation, the crystalline being sounded uncertain. This serves no logical purpose. It contains no scientific information. It is purely expressive. That's not nothing, I said. That's actually everything. Look, the archive is full of facts, right? But facts don't care about meaning. They don't care about why things matter. I gestured at the flowing data. This is the Archie-7 telling you why they thought storing all those facts was worth the effort. This is them saying that the universe isn't just something to be measured and catalogued. It's something to be experienced. Plinth's lights cycled through colors I didn't have names for. The species responsible for sealing this was incredibly sophisticated, Plinth observed. They encrypted their most important archive with a lock that only an emotional being would understand. They chose feeling over logic as their security measure. Yeah, I said, grinning despite how exhausted I was. They basically said the password to the most important thing in the galaxy was be human about it. And that's either the worst security decision or the best one, depending on how you look at it. The data stream slowed, then stabilized. The black cube was gone completely now, replaced by a gentle luminescence that filled the entire chamber. It was beautiful, not because it was technically impressive, but because you could feel the intention behind it. Someone, millions of years ago, had preserved their voice and their art and their music, and they'd hidden it behind a lock that only made sense to creatures who understood what it meant to be alive, in a way that could not be reduced to equations. I sat down because my legs suddenly decided they were done supporting me. Around me, the most advanced civilization in the galaxy was processing the fact that they'd been outsmarted by a human with a song. Life was weird. I liked it that way. Once the initial chaos settled down and everyone stopped trying to process what had just happened, we got to actually look at what was inside Layer 0. And let me tell you, it was worth being absolutely terrifying for those 24 hours beforehand. The archive chamber transformed into something resembling a museum, if that museum had been designed by beings who understood that you can preserve data while still preserving wonder. The music played continuously now, thousands of voices singing in languages older than most of the species present. Alongside the music came visuals, abstract representations of concepts that made your brain feel like it was expanding in multiple directions simultaneously. Sentinel-7 led a full analysis of the contents, and here's where things got properly interesting. Layer 0 wasn't just art and music, it was also a warning. The Archie-7 had discovered something approximately 7 million years ago. Something about the fabric of reality itself. Something about a cyclical extinction event that happened roughly every 10 million years across multiple dimensional planes. It was basically the universe's way of resetting, like a cosmic save file being overwritten. The Archie-7 had calculated that one was coming in the next 200,000 years, and they wanted to leave a message for whoever was around to find it. This is catastrophic, Vextor said, reading through the data with its characteristic understatement. If accurate, approximately 80% of currently existing civilizations will be extinct before this cycle completes. Yeah, that's the whole reason they buried this, I said, still marveling at how casually the Archie-7 had just thrown an extinction event into the archive and called it a day. They weren't just preserving art. They were preserving a warning. They were saying, hey, future beings, heads up, the universe is going to try to kill you in about 200,000 years. So maybe think about that. But here's the thing that really got me. Layer 0 also contains something else, something the Archie-7 had preserved alongside the warning about extinction. They'd preserved themselves, their stories, individual voices of Archie-7 beings speaking directly to whoever came after them, not explaining science, not leaving instruction manuals, just existing, singing, sharing what it meant to be alive before the extinction came for them. I found one particular voice that made me stop everything else I was doing. It was an elderly Archie-7 being, I think. The voice was worn with age and what sounded like wisdom, and they were singing about watching a sunset with someone they loved, about knowing that the end was coming eventually, either personal or cosmic, but choosing to enjoy the moment anyway. We record this not as fact, the voice translated through my implant. We record this as evidence that we existed, that we felt, that we loved and created and dreamed, even knowing the cosmos would eventually erase us. We leave this for whoever finds it so they understand. The meaning isn't in lasting forever. The meaning is in making the attempt. The meaning is in singing when the darkness comes. I had to sit down again. Twice in one day. A new personal record. This is illogical, Vextor observed, but its crystalline structure had taken on a slightly different quality. Something almost like emotion, if emotions could be expressed through mathematical harmony. They preserved artistic expression instead of practical information. They prioritized the emotional significance of their existence over survival data. They knew the warning alone wouldn't matter, I said, finally understanding what the Archie-7 had been doing all along. They knew that if you just dropped an extinction event warning on someone, the response would be panic or denial. But if you wrapped it in context, if you said, here's our music, here's our stories, here's what it meant to be us, here's what you're trying to preserve by listening to this warning, then maybe future beings would actually care enough to do something about it. Plinth's bioluminescence had shifted into patterns I'd never seen before. My translator was struggling to process it, but the general meaning seemed to be something like profound respect mixed with deep regret. The Archie-7 were correct, Plinth pulsed. No amount of logical argument could have compelled action as effectively as understanding that the warning came from beings with inner lives as complex and meaningful as our own. They made themselves matter by sharing why their survival mattered. The Keepers were already running calculations on the extinction event warning, cross-referencing it with their own observations of cosmic phenomena. Preliminary findings suggested the Archie-7 had been completely accurate. There was a pattern, an undeniable cycle in universal destruction and renewal that nobody had ever noticed before because nobody had been looking for it. And the only reason we were looking for it now was because a human had sung a song and convinced the universe that feelings were a valid form of encryption. Sentinel-7 approached me, its bureaucratic form somehow managing to convey something like gratitude, despite being literally made of administrative procedures. Marcus Webb, it said formally. Your methodology was unconventional and initially appeared counterproductive. However, the results are undeniable. Layer 0 contained both critical warning data and philosophical frameworks that will require civilization to fundamentally reconsider its approach to preservation and meaning. So, basically, I translated, you're saying I did good? Yes, Sentinel-7 said. Though I must formally note that this will require at least 200 additional approval processes to properly document the precedent you have established. The Archival Committee is already convening emergency sessions to discuss how to categorize an access methodology based on emotional authenticity. I laughed. Even in the middle of discovering an extinction event, warning from a million-year-old civilization, the bureaucracy persisted. Tell the committee they can file their emergency sessions where the sun doesn't shine, I said cheerfully. I'm going to go listen to some ancient alien music and try to process the fact that I just helped save the galaxy by being bad at singing. The next few weeks were a blur of politics and bureaucracy. The Galactic Council had to decide what to do with the extinction event warning. They had to decide what to do with Layer 0. They had to decide what to do with me, the human who'd somehow become the person who'd unlocked the most important data in galactic history through the power of emotional honesty and bad acoustics. There were three major factions in the council meetings. First, there were the species who wanted to weaponize the extinction warning, basically using it as leverage to consolidate power before the supposedly inevitable extinction event. I had some very pointed conversations with them about how the entire point of what the Archie-7 had done was to encourage cooperation, not competition, but I don't think it stuck. Second, there were species who wanted to suppress the information entirely. They calculated, quite logically, that knowing about an extinction event happening in 200,000 years would cause civilization-wide depression and economic collapse. Better to not know, they argued. Better to live in ignorant peace than informed terror. I had even more pointed conversations with them, possibly involving throwing things. But then there were the species who actually understood what the Archie-7 had been trying to do. The ones who got that the point of preserving the warning wasn't to cause panic or power grabs. It was to inspire a fundamental shift in how civilization approached its future. To turn crisis into opportunity. To basically say, hey, we've got 200,000 years to figure out how to survive this. What are we waiting for? The vote went that direction, thank the universe. The council established the Memorial Resonance Project. Every species in the known galaxy was invited to contribute their own art, music, literature, and personal stories to a new layer in the archive. The idea was that if the Archie-7 could use their culture to inspire cooperation, maybe other species could do the same. Maybe they could build a civilization that was united not by fear of extinction, but by shared understanding of what they were all trying to preserve. It was simultaneously the most idealistic and most practical thing any Galactic Council had ever attempted. I was offered an immediate promotion to Chief Archivist, which would have come with a massive salary, a title that took approximately 4 minutes to fully pronounce, and approximately 0 actual work I wanted to do. I turned it down. I was offered ambassador status to the Keepers, which would have given me political influence and access to restricted areas of the archive. I turned that down too. I was offered my own museum, a research facility named after me, and a statue made of some kind of crystalline substance that supposedly would last for 1,000,000 years. I specifically requested that they not make the statue because I was pretty sure a statue of me would immediately become a target for all the species I'd offended during the council meetings. What I actually wanted to do was stay at the archive. Not as administrator or politician or figurehead, just as someone who loved the work of cataloging and preserving and making sure that millions of voices didn't disappear into the dark. The council was so confused by my refusal of every offer that they eventually just agreed to whatever I asked for. So there I was, still Marcus Webb, still marginally qualified, now guardian of the archive, with basically unlimited resources and 0 political obligations. Best career move I'd ever made, even if it did involve nearly getting the entire repository destroyed. I spent the first year just cataloging Layer 0 properly, not analyzing it, not politicizing it, just carefully, methodically, going through each piece of Archie 7 culture and preserving it in a way that future civilizations could access. I recorded the voices, I transcribed the poetry, I analyzed the mathematics behind the music, which turned out to be incredibly complex and also incredibly beautiful. Vextor spent approximately 3 months just studying the harmonic structures in a single Archie 7 song. The musical composition is exquisite, Vextor admitted, which, coming from a being made of math, was basically the highest compliment it could offer. The Archie 7 understood that beauty and logic are not mutually exclusive concepts. They simply refused to prioritize one over the other. During that first year, I also recorded my own message for the archive. Nothing fancy, nothing meant to be profound. Just me, sitting in one of the archive's quiet rooms, talking about what it meant to be human. I talked about being imperfect and emotional and stubborn. I talked about how humans had this ridiculous habit of hoping even when hope made no logical sense. I talked about how we loved and created and dreamed, not because it would guarantee our survival, but because survival without those things didn't seem worth the effort. I ended the recording with a sarcastic remark about how the universe probably didn't need humans to be important, but we'd somehow managed to be important anyway. Then I filed it away in Layer 0. Just another voice in the 1,000,000 voices that were suddenly part of a conversation about what it meant to exist before the darkness came again. 5 years later, I was sitting in the archive's central chamber when Sentinel-7 found me. I'd gotten older in that 5 years, wearier, but also, somehow, more certain about what I was doing. The archive had changed completely since the Memorial Resonance Project launched. Every species was contributing now. There was music from civilizations that had never produced music before, literature from beings who experienced reality in fundamentally different ways than humans did, art that required you to perceive it through dimensions I couldn't even visualize. The archive had stopped being a sterile repository of facts and become something closer to a living memorial, a conversation across millions of years between beings trying to say, we were here, we mattered, we understood beauty even if we couldn't calculate it. The extinction warning had turned out to be extremely accurate. A preliminary detection of dimensional instability in the outer regions suggested the extinction cycle was beginning, right on schedule. But instead of causing panic, it had sparked this incredible cooperative effort. Civilizations that had been competing for resources suddenly started pooling their research. Species that had been enemies found themselves working on survival strategies together. The Archie 7's warning had basically united the galaxy through shared crisis and shared purpose. I'd received approximately 3,000 thank you messages from various beings across all known space. I'd deleted all of them. The Council has discovered something interesting, Sentinel-7 announced. its bureaucratic form managing to convey excitement, which was impressive for a being made of paperwork and procedure. During preliminary scans of Layer 0 storage, we identified evidence of additional sealed layers. Layer -1, Layer -2, an entire series of preserved information, each sealed with a different methodology. I looked up at Sentinel-7 and I started laughing. "You're telling me," I said, "that there's not just one mystery archive, but multiple archives, all sealed by species that specifically engineered them so only certain types of minds could unlock them." "Preliminary analysis suggests this is accurate," Sentinel-7 confirmed. The Archi-7 appear to have anticipated that their warning would require multiple perspectives to properly understand and act upon. They encoded different pieces of the solution in layers that would respond to different types of consciousness. Your emotional accessibility of Layer 0 appears to have been only the first step in a much more complex preservation strategy. I stood up and walked to the observation window. The archive extended outward in all directions, a monument to preservation and beauty and the stubborn human insistence that meaning mattered even in an uncaring universe. Outside the window I could see ships arriving from 100 different worlds, bringing art and music and stories, adding their voices to the chorus of the dead and the living, all trying to say the same thing. We were here, we tried, we loved. "So basically," I said, turning back to Sentinel-7, "we just cracked open the first door. There's going to be more mysteries, more layers, probably more ridiculous solutions that don't make any logical sense." "Probability assessment indicates you are correct," Sentinel-7 said. "Civilization may require several more decades to access all sealed layers. Each one will likely present novel challenges requiring novel methodologies." I grinned, because if there's one thing I'd learned in the past 5 years, it's that the universe wasn't interested in giving easy answers. It was interested in asking the right questions. The Archi-7 hadn't preserved their entire civilization just to leave data. They'd preserved themselves as a message that said, even though we're gone, even though the extinction came, we're still here in your thoughts. We still matter because someone remembered us. Someone learned from us. Someone heard our song and understood that songs were worth preserving. "All right," I told Sentinel-7, already walking back toward the archive proper. "Let's find out what Layer -1 has to say. And get me a lot of coffee because I have a feeling this is going to get even weirder before it gets better." "Statistically speaking," Sentinel-7 replied, "it almost certainly will. And that, my friends, is the thing about the universe. It's unpredictable, illogical, and absolutely impossible to understand without embracing the parts of yourself that don't make sense. But it's also full of possibilities. Full of mysteries waiting to be solved by being stubborn enough to try things nobody else would dare attempt. The archive stored 1,000,000 voices, and only a human's song unlocked the hidden layer. But more importantly, that song proved something that the Archi-7 had known all along. That meaning wasn't something you calculated or measured or proved. It was something you felt. And feelings, it turned out, were the most powerful encryption the universe had ever devised. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got several sealed layers of ancient wisdom to interpret, and probably a few thousand more approval processes to ignore. Welcome to working at the archive. It's ridiculous, it's impossible, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.